Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you here. We're really excited. My name is Jill Norcross. I am the Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance, here with my colleague, Hannah Matuda. And here today, we're very excited to have them back by special request. Ken Crawford, the COO of Affordable Homes and Communities, AHC, and Josh Child, Project Manager from Affordable Homes and Communities. I think you all know that these presenters were with us back at the end of October to cover a very challenging topic of affordable housing finance, but we had such a huge response and so many questions that we did not have the opportunity to address in the first session, that we invited them back again to talk a little bit more about affordable housing finance using a case study example of the terraces at Arlington View. This is a new construction affordable community built in Arlington, opened last year. Just so you have some background about kind of the way we're going to run the show today is we're going to let them, Ken and Josh, do an overview at the terraces of Arlington View and the financing structure, in case you weren't with us in October, to get you up to speed. And the rest of the time is going to be spent with Ken and Josh and I, kind of in a Q&A session where we're going to cover specific questions that you've already sent to us when you registered or were left over from the last session on that specific project. Then we'll move into questions on the low-income housing tax credit and local government finance. Then we'll cover some big picture general questions. And we'll end today's session with kind of a speed round about the future of affordable housing finance. And if we have time, to be honest with you, which I kind of doubt, we will answer any additional questions you might have in the chat. I do just want to, before I turn it over to Josh and Ken, say that in case you all haven't heard, our big news in 2024 is that Navaja has merged with the Alliance for Housing Solutions. We're really excited to be partnering with this 20-year-old housing education and advocacy organization focused in Arlington. We are working on the implementation of this unification, hence our two logos that will become one at some point. So stay tuned. We really appreciate everybody's support. I think this is going to make both of our organizations a lot stronger, and we're excited to kind of continue to share information with you as this progresses. Another thing, hopefully, that you can capture in the chat, Hannah is going to be adding some resources for additional further education, training opportunities for you, because there's no way we're going to cover all of this in a second hour. This is a really complicated, challenging topic. Ken and Josh have worked decades in affordable housing development and finance. People spend their entire careers. But the reason why I personally love this work is that we have solutions. We have these tools to solve our affordable housing problems, but it's not a perfect, efficient system. It is a lot of hard work. We're happy to kind of just share a little bit of what they know with you today. So pleased to turn it over to Ken and Josh. Thank you again for your generosity and being with us, your time and preparation for this session to give an overview at the terraces at Arlington View.
Absolutely. Thanks. I'm going to lead off and start sharing my screen now. Okay. I am Josh Child, and I'm a development manager with AHC. Ken will be the main course for this presentation, but I just wanted to open with a little reminder context about the site that we're talking about in our case study example. This is the terraces at Arlington View East. It's located in Arlington, in the Arlington View neighborhood, right off Columbia Pike. We just wrapped up in 2023 a redevelopment of an old 30-unit building that was actually part of, this site and community that we have here was AHC's first acquisition back in the 80s. This is the first kind of wholesale redevelopment, not renovation, that we've done. So we took a 30-unit building, we used Arlington's neighborhood form-based code, and we created 77 new homes, and we're able to relocate.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
All of our former families on this site. So we've got 77 new units, all affordable at 60% AMI and below. Some fun features of this site: we used Virginia Housing's Universal Design Standard, so all of our units have accessibility features, modifications, and spaces. This property offers free residential Wi-Fi to folks. We have a couple green features that we're pretty proud of. We have rooftop solar installed. And for part of our stormwater management needs, we also used a partial green roof on one segment of our roof. And at this site, we have a large community room. There are other buildings that are part of our community here. So we intentionally made it large, spacious, and room enough to welcome all of our folks in this community into this new hub at the new property. We've also got an on-site resident services manager, which is so important, working with the property management staff on site and with residents, and as kind of a service coordinator to bring in outside folks as well. Now I'll turn it over to Ken to give a rundown of finance.
Great. Thanks, Josh. And thank you to Navaha for providing the opportunity for us to be able to do this. I'm going to make this pretty rapid in the sense that the last time we were together, we kind of walked through process and budgets. And so I'm just going to do a really quick rundown on the sources and uses. And then we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the sources side of the house. That's the real estate finance piece. One of the things that I think everybody that's involved in this industry is well aware of is that, doing affordable housing is challenging work. The timelines that it takes to find opportunities, to get the opportunities to fit in the box, to then get the box financed, to ultimately get it built, leased, and operating. It's definitely longer than straight up for-profit real estate development work. I would say the most rapidly that I've ever seen a project come to fruition is probably 36 months from the twinkle in the developer's eye to the closing table. And I've been involved in projects that take 4, 5, 6 years to get to the closing table. And remember, getting to the closing table is just the start. Then you got to build it, then you got to lease it, then you got to operate it. So, looking at this particular slide here, it shows the sources and uses. There are just some really basic pieces of real estate finance that are important to understand. On the development side, the whole concept of sources and uses is really the foundational piece of what you do from a real estate development side of the house. I'm going to talk quickly about the uses side, just because that's actually when we go through on a line by line here, the acquisition. So that's either going to be the land and or the land in the building if you're going to do a rehabilitation. Typically speaking, in affordable housing, you're going to want the acquisition cost to be as low as you possibly can get it, in the sense that when we talk about the sources, oftentimes the acquisition price will oftentimes dictate how big of a gap the transaction might have. And the gap is where we'll talk about the gap in just a few minutes here. Hard construction cost, as you can see in this particular transaction, $29.2 million, and hard construction costs are always the largest piece of the sources side of the house. Soft cost or the cost for all the different non-hard cost elements, which include architecture, engineering, environmental, legal. There's a whole myriad of soft costs that go along with the transaction. Reserves. In low-income housing tax credit work, we have investors that come into the transactions, and over time, one of the mitigants to reduce some of the risk in a transaction is setting up reserves up front. And so that is another piece of the uses that we underwrite into a transaction. Those reserves are typically operating reserves. They might include a lease-up reserve. They also might include replacement reserves that are funded up front. The developer fee, that is, in essence, the one-time fee that a developer is going to make as it relates to an affordable housing transaction. The developer fee by the low-income housing tax credit statute allows you to take a fee of up to 15% of, just broadly speaking, I'll call it the total development fees. That being said, that is what was written into the Section 42 code. Over time, the ability for a developer to earn a full 15% fee has diminished pretty dramatically over the life of the low-income housing tax credit, partly because low-income housing tax credits are there's a finite supply of tax credits, and I think there is not an infinite demand, but that differential of supply and demand has allowed for the ability for housing finance agencies that often, and or soft lenders that are providing resources into affordable housing. What they have done is asked, okay, developer, if you're keen on doing this project, instead of earning a 15% fee, how about if you only earn a 12% fee or a 10% fee or an 8% fee? And as a contribution into the transaction that will ideally try to lower the total development cost. But I just want to make the point that on a developer fee, that is the one income stream that a developer makes, typically speaking, in an affordable project. And I'm going to speak to the other quote unquote income stream, which is cash flow. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then there's financing and construction loan interest. That's all part of the uses side of the transaction. So going to the sources side, Josh, if you can go to the next piece here.
Yep.
All right. So on the sources side of the house, I want to talk about three different things on the sources side. The first one is permanent debt. There are two pieces of the this is what we call the capital stack on the sources side. And there are two pieces of the capital stack that are technically relatively easy to come up with. The first one is what's listed here, it's highlighted, is the senior permanent debt. Senior permanent debt is defined by revenue minus operating expenses gets you to net operating income, and it's from your net operating income that you pay your must-pay senior permanent debt. So therefore, the revenue and operating expense that you underwrite into your transaction will help you define the permanent debt as part of your capital stack. Okay. The second piece that's relatively easy to define are the low-income housing tax credits. This particular transaction, it's a little bit complicated because it's a 4 and 9% combination transaction. That being said, what I want to do is say tax credits, again, are a calculation. What they do is they take, again, I'm just going to say total development costs because it's easier to talk about in this framework. It's not exactly total development costs. It's actually what's called eligible basis. But the low-income housing tax credits are a calculation of, again, what is called basis. And they simply apply a factor against that basis to figure out how many tax credits are generated. What we do as a developer is we then take those tax credits out into the marketplace and sell the tax credits. Tax credits are a dollar for dollar offset against income of the company that buys the tax credits. So it's a dollar for dollar offset. That being said, the investors, because it's an investment, the investors that invest in low-income housing tax credits expect a return on their money. So while we have a $1 tax credit that we're selling, and it's a collection of them, it's often thousands, if not millions of tax credits that we are selling, the investor will invest somewhere between, let's just say, in the old days, it could have been as low as 70 cents per tax credit. In today's environment, it's probably somewhere in the low 80s to the low 90s per tax credit that they invest into the project. Okay. But what I want you to take away from this is permanent debt and low-income housing tax credits are definable by the mathematics of the transaction. Okay. Now let's go to the third piece, collective piece of the capital stack. And this third piece is what we refer to as gap financing. So you have a total development cost of $41 million. We've been able to define two separate pieces so far, which is the permanent debt and the tax credit equity that's going to come into the transaction. But those two numbers added together does not equal the total development cost. So this is where I always say with all of my developers that I work with, this is where they earn their stripes. I'm an ex-military guy. So in order to get promoted, you have to, you earn your stripes. And the way that you earn your stripes is by having the skill set and tenacity to go out and find gap financing. In our particular transaction here, you can see it's a relatively complicated grouping of gap financing. And Josh, are you going to walk through the gap financing? Or you want me
yeah,
to
I
walk
definitely
through?
can if you want to sub me in, or Jill might
Okay.
have a question related to
All
it.
right. Well,
Yeah.
all right. Let me just go very quickly through the gap financing very quickly. Just and Josh will probably be able to speak about some of the specifics on some of the gap financing. And I think we actually talk about that to some degree in some of the questions. But the gap sources here are made up of an Arlington County loan, which is a program called AHIF. These are competitive dollars. You have to apply for them. Arlington County funds into this loan fund, typically on an annual basis. But we were able to secure $7 million of county soft money into the transaction. And when I say soft money, it means that to the extent that there is cash flow in a transaction, that will be the source of repayment on the county loan. But to the extent that there is not cash flow, it means that they will not default the loan. Okay. The AHC sponsor loan. So the AHC sponsor loan in this instance was a hard investment that we made into the transaction of cash in the transaction. I will say from a developer point of view, it's certainly in for-profit real estate development work, the cash investment is typically going to be somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 30% of the total development cost. In affordable housing, ideally as a developer, we don't want to be putting, because at least in our organization, we're a nonprofit organization, so it's not like we bring a lot of money to the bottom line. But in this particular instance, we made a concerted hard equity contribution of $1 million into this transaction. The county, Arlington County TOA, again, this is another Arlington County loan program that again we applied for and were awarded dollars. The deferred development fee. So you heard me say when we were talking about uses that by statute, the development fee can be up to 15% of the total cost, and I'm using that as a round number, the total cost of a transaction. In today's world, oftentimes we as a developer are being asked to put some of our fee back into the transaction, essentially as additional equity or sponsorship of the transaction. And I think if we look back at the developer fee, which was $2.8 million, we've deferred here plus or minus like 35% of our fee. We have reinvested it into the transaction. All right, Virginia Housing Trust Fund. Again, this is another soft fund that we apply for. It's highly competitive. We ended up getting some dollars through the trust fund. And then lastly, in this particular transaction, we ended up taking back a seller's note. And really what this is our contribution of the land value into the transaction. So you can see where AHC has put in not a sponsor loan of hard cash, a deferred developer fee, which is again another contribution, and we have not taken cash out of the transaction for the land. In essentially by having a seller's note, we're essentially contributing the land into the partnership. So these those three large categories: debt, equity, tax credit equity, and the soft sources are the three components of the capital stack and that go into each and every affordable housing transaction that we do. I think that was going to be the quick summary, right, Josh? Now
Yeah.
we're going to turn to questions.
Yep.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So really such a helpful overview. I'm going to ask you just a couple questions about the Terraces at Arlington View, and then we'll kind of move on to some other general like tax credit and local government questions. But so one thing that's important, and I think especially if you are able to be awarded tax credits, is the provision of resident services for the people who live in your communities. And how do you finance that typically?
Ken can probably speak to macro. I can say in particular, we have some new sites that we've developed recently where we've been able to work resident services into the operating budget itself. It's a balance, and sometimes funders, especially, you know, when a government resource is required to pay for additional OpEx, sort of in a way, it's an important investment to the property, but sometimes you're able to work it into the budget to make the economics work, and sometimes it's more of a macro approach through grants, and as an organization, AHC Inc. fundraises that part of our mission. Developer fee, like, you know, all the fees we make go back into the corporate budget. Do you want to speak more on that, Ken? Broadly?
Okay, yeah. So Josh makes the point, and when I was talking earlier about the way that the development side of the house earns revenue for the organization, and earning revenue for the organization is what keeps the organization running. We pay for salaries, we keep the lights on, etc. And one of the things that I always talk about in affordable housing, which is different from for-profit housing, and hopefully you can see me, and I'm not seeing myself on the screen, but one of the things that I talk about whenever I'm talking about affordable housing is that first I start out with the contrast of what for-profit real estate development work is kind of the fundamental of it is, which is, if this is the revenue line and this is the operating expense line, in the for-profit real estate development world, what we're trying to do is maximize revenues against the operating expenses. And the delta here, that's cash flow. And cash flow generates value, okay? And that's why people get involved in for-profit real estate development work all the time, okay? That's the vision. It's a fundamental understanding in for-profit real estate development work. So if that's that world, what we do in the affordable world is try to keep rents as affordable as we can. So what we do is this. We're trying to keep rents as low as we can within the programs in which we operate. But you can see, or maybe you can't see, but there's not a lot of cash flow that gets generated by virtue of this fundamental dynamic of keeping revenues low, or keeping rents low is the better way to say it. By keeping rents low, the project itself doesn't generate a lot of income. That being said, the rents that are charged have to cover the operating expenses. Has to pay real estate taxes, got to pay insurance, got to pay for repair and maintenance, you got to pay for staff, you got to, all that is part of operating expenses. And as you can see in this particular scenario here, there's not going to be a lot of cash flow that gets generated from a typical affordable housing deal. So then the question becomes, if we're going to layer resident services into a project, the fact is, since you're not generating a lot of cash flow, how do you cover the expenses of resident services? So as Josh noted, to the extent that you can figure out as part of your capital stack or part of the underwriting, the ability for the project to generate some of that cash flow to be able to pay for resident services, that's the ideal scenario. Oftentimes, that's not the case. As such, our resident services here at AHC, we do a lot of fundraising to basically cover the cost of the resident services that are provided. And ultimately, the development fee that we earn from a developer point of view, which is organizational revenue, to the extent that there is cash flow that comes down to the bottom line for our organization, oftentimes what we are doing is we fund the resident services at our properties. So, and as far as, from an AHC perspective, and I think there are a lot of people in the affordable housing world and environment say that affordable housing is more than just putting a roof over someone's head. A lot of the communities that we operate in have other challenges, and bringing high quality, committed resident services to the table is really, really important. And it's actually, we've made an organizational commitment to any projects that we do going forward will absolutely have to be, we will figure out the funding source to be able to provide resident services to the communities. Resident services can be educational, workforce, health, it's many and varied that are the type of services that we can bring to the table. But it's a wicked important aspect of not just building a roof over someone's head, but actually creating opportunity and community where our residents and the community can benefit from the ultimate real estate development work. Sorry, that was a little long-winded. We're gonna have to we're gonna have to shrink the.
I think the synthesis is all of the above. All of the above is the synthesis, just like the gap financing, great donors, volunteers, grants, institutional revenue,
right?
And hopefully more and more properties including that in their own budget as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. Can you talk a little bit about if there is special financing for those, the most subsidized, the most deeply subsidized units, those serving the lowest AMIs, and any green features that you noted that were in the community?
I could take this one. The gap portion that's left over doesn't necessarily have to be that large if you don't charge sort of rents to lower kind of AMI demographics. So if this property only had rents at the 60% AMI level, the gap would be a little bit smaller. So I would say that sort of all of the gap sources go to being able to provide units with 30% AMI rents. We have 50% AMI rents in this property as well. So we are targeting.
Josh, just as a follow-up, going back to my really simple model is when the the more restrictive the rents or targeting lower and lower income tiers, what that does is, let's say this is a pure market rate deal. Okay, a 60% AMI deal might be here, but to the extent you go deeper into the AMIs, 50, 40, 30, it just keeps going down. And the further the revenue stream goes down, it means the less first mortgage you're going to be able to get, which increases the gap, which then requires the necessity to go out and find additional soft money. So it's ultimately about revenue and how revenue ultimately generates net operating incomes / cash flow, which will define how you come up with your sources to cover your uses.
Yeah. And in particular for the green features, I know that was a part of this as well. We did, as part of our total kind of equity with our low-income housing tax credit, coincidentally, the same investor, there's a very small piece of that is a couple $100,000 or so of tax credits for solar. So there's a solar tax credit program out there that we often talk to our investors about as kind of adding on where we have solar. The green roof itself is interesting. I think it's a good thing, but it's part of our required stormwater management. So in the absence of a green roof feature, we would have a larger vault underneath the parking garage, basically to catch stormwater overflow. So there wasn't special financing for the green roof component on this one.
That's great. Okay, one more question just on terraces at Arlington View. Can you just talk a little bit about how the AHIF component was structured? So this is a housing trust fund for our Lunch and Learn audience. We talk a lot about housing trust funds, and Arlington's is called AHIF, and just how you structured that into the deal and any special features of that or how it gets paid back. Maybe if there's construction cost savings, do you do a split? Just how that source is used.
Yeah, I can take this one.
Yeah.
So Arlington's AHIP program is incredible, and with this deal, when there was sort of a normal NOFA cycle, the year before you apply for your competitive funds at the tax credit level, Arlington usually sets up their projects that they support to win this local gap subsidy. It helps you score more points on your tax credit application. So back in 2019, this was before my time at AHC, we would have won that. Yes, there are sort of cost savings provisions with AHIF money. And as a soft source, it's not a required repayment structure, but it is shared cash flow. So the AHIF soft loan with the county and AHC's deferred developer fee for IRS compliance kind of rules, those are the two pieces of our gap sources that are prioritized repayments in the first 15 years of the deal. Our deferred developer fee has to be sized so that we can pay it off before year 15, or there are some penalties within the tax credit program. So for the first 15 years, half of whatever the property generates in additional cash flow after debt service goes to Arlington County and goes to AHC to pay off AHIF and deferred developer fee. What we do this year, after the building's sort of up and running, you do your cost certification, it goes through Virginia Housing to be vetted, and there's something called an 8609 that's an IRS form. The numbers that are printed in that will be like that is what we will base if there were cost savings. There's a shared savings provision with that with AHIF.
Awesome. Excellent. So that small cash flow sliver that Ken demonstrated has to get split again, paying back to the local government in this case.
Right.
They can recycle those funds to make more AHIF contributions for future housing developments or preservation. So just
right. And that's why every annual budget includes, like, ideally an AHIF funding, because the repayment that they are actually able to get, the missions are aligned with AHIF and the developers that Arlington gives awards AHIF loans to, but it doesn't repay itself quickly like maybe a regular mortgage would. So we're partners in this for the long run.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, we had some questions on tax credits. I know that's a really complicated topic, and I know there's also a question about the 4% tax credits. You spoke that this project has both the 9% and 4s, and how that relates to bond financing. It's probably too big. I don't know if you have a couple of sentences about that specifically. I know Hannah is going to be sharing in the chat other places where you can seek additional training on affordable housing development, specifically tax credit programs and how all the sources combine. But if you have any comments on that and
Yeah.
Sure.
This
So
one is
then-
actually 9% only, just
Oh, it's
just-
on 9%.
Oh,
This-
I'm
this one is
sorry,
not-
I stand corrected. Yeah.
Sorry.
So just very quickly on 4 and 9%. So low-income housing tax credits come in, there are two flavors. The 9% tax credit, 9% tax credits are allocated on a state-by-state basis. I believe it's still on a per capita basis. And in 9%, there's a finite number of 9% credits every state has. Every state has what's called a qualified allocation plan, and they tell all the rules by which they will give out their 9% credits. But because there's only a finite amount of them, and there's such demand for affordable housing, those 9% credits have become incredibly valuable, and housing finance agencies have realized the value of that credit. And for those of us that are doing development work, over time, they've layered additional requirements on, which has done great things to improve affordable housing, but it's also increased the cost of affordable housing over time. But a 9% credit it's extremely competitive, and there's only a finite amount of them that are allocated on an annual basis. The 4% credit is a tax credit that is generated when you use tax-exempt bonds to develop affordable housing. The difference between a 4% credit and a 9% credit is the 9% credits will generate somewhere between, I don't know, 50 to 70% of the development cost of a transaction, whereas a 4% transaction, they're only generating somewhere between 30 and 50% of the cost or of the capital stack. So the 9% are more valuable. It generates more equity than does a 4%. I will say that historically speaking, well, let me say it differently. The 9% credit have become so wickedly competitive that a lot of developers have gone to doing 4% transactions because the availability of 9% has shrunk over time because there's such demand for it. So therefore, a lot of developers are out there developing 4% deals. As it turns out, there used to be more than enough bonds out there to be able to cover the 4% transactions that people wanted to do. But with the increase in the number of folks that are doing development work in affordable housing, that even now the bond allocation, the tax-exempt bonds are now oversubscribed, just like 9% credits are oversubscribed. So it's simply a different, the tax credit itself is the same. It's a dollar for dollar offset against income. It's a tax advantage investment, but the 9% generates a lot more credits than does a 4%. They're now both competitive in their own way under each of the individual programs. This is one piece of low-income housing tax credits that is wickedly complicated, and there's a lot of nuance to both programs, and I'll leave it at that.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. So what happens when your local government approves the entitlements, the land use entitlements for a development, and you're relying on this competitive financing, whether it's the 9s or the 4s in the bond? What happens if the financing doesn't come through? What do you do? What do the local governments do? What do you do? What's the next step if you don't get that award?
So, I mean, and I'll let Josh speak to this a little bit, but just generally speaking, having done this for the last 30 years and at several different organizations, I mean, what you do is you get in line to some degree. If you already control the land and you've gotten the entitlements, then like for a 9% application, you can put in an application based on the qualified allocation plan, and certainly in the state of Virginia, where it actually gets scored, and then you find out where you're going to fall based on your scoring. And to the extent that you don't fall in the money, i.e. that you're going to get tax credits, you're going to be able to then look, if you don't get the tax credits, you're going to then be able to look at your application and say, okay, what do I need to modify to be more competitive in the next round? And typically speaking, at least it's been my experience in the affordable housing world, that the opportunities, the piece of ground, the building that you may have, they're it's not like they're unicorns, but they're few and far between, such that if you can find a piece of ground with a community that supports it, you've gotten the entitlements, and maybe you've gotten some soft funds to kind of kickstart the whole process, then if you've got those elements, my experience has been, it may not happen the first application, it may not happen the second application, but it's been my experience that rarely does someone just go, forget it, we're not going to do this. It's just you sort of grin and bear it, but just make sure that everyone's crystal clear that when you do that, time is money. And it just means that if you didn't get your 9% allocation this year, that means I've got to carry the ground. I got to keep my my professionals engaged. And next year when I apply, more than likely the cost of the transaction are going to go up just by virtue of inflation. So it's that's what you do. And Josh, I'm not sure if you have any other thoughts.
I don't have much other to add other than zoning distinct from financing and the get in line exactly. The timeline's so precarious with especially going after the competitive 9% because it's a one shot every year, and if you lose, you add on 12 more months. So zoning will eventually expire, and there are ways to kind of go through a reapproval process, but the ideal is it gives you a long enough window to try really hard for financing a couple of times before having to deal with zoning issues.
Great, thank you. So we know the tax credit program is the chief way that we are able to get affordable housing developed, but can you all talk if there's any other development you've done outside of the tax credit program, and what were the funding sources? And you know, what and additionally, maybe are there other sources for mixed use, mixed income development with market rate and affordable, or is that do you use tax credit financing for those types of developments too?
I would say 98% of the work that I've done has been in 4 and 9% work from the affordable housing world. If I'm not mistaken, I mean, there are rural development programs. I think there's the 811 program through HUD, which are alternative financing paths for some level of affordability. So
Yeah.
that's been my experience. And then I would say on the mixed income side, I mean, mixed income is something that I think we all within the community believe is the right thing to do, is, that you're not concentrating low income, communities, all together. The idea of having, market rate and workforce and tax credit, or, moderate income, low and moderate income housing all together is, I think it's a great idea. I will say that typically speaking, when I've seen market rate and tax credit deals together, typically speaking, I've seen them separated. The financing structures are separated. So it's not like the affordable gets subsidized by the market rate. They're typically, while they may be combined in a building, typically speaking, what you're going to have is a capital stack for the affordable and a capital stack for the market rate. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Yeah, I would just say AHC historically has done home ownership in its earlier years, and we have the one that comes to mind. There's a community called Davis Place in Arlington that we built for home ownership, affordable home ownership condo community with Arlington County. And I think it's important. I know that you guys have a Novogradac resource, and it's a little technical, but good to pull through if folks are interested in the income range when you're serving 60 to 30% anyway. That slice of the DMV population, at least. We have some 3-bedroom units at the 60% rent range that go to families of 4 or 5 earning almost $90,000 a year, down to maybe if we had a studio or 1-bedroom for a single person household at 30% AMI might only be making $30,000 a year. So there is some mixing just by the different levels of income targeting that the programs that are important.
That's awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And I guess just another note is, when we talk about inclusionary zoning or affordable dwelling unit ADU programs, that is when a market rate developer is required by the locality to include a certain number of affordable units, but that's a much smaller number. So our LIHTC buildings and buildings that are finance market, maybe mixed income, really kind of are able to move the needle on our affordable housing unit goals as we go through. So tell me a little bit. I guess it is an important season as we look at local budgets and as we're talking with our state representatives during General Assembly session about what message you think advocates, I know we have many advocates on this training today, what messages you think are important to bring to elected officials about affordable housing finance.
Well, that's as a developer, I'm always concerned just about timelines. Some of the zoning and entitlement processes take quite a bit of time to get through. There are often, I think, in the affordable housing environment, in particular, oftentimes people are looking at affordable housing to do lots of different things, to bring investment in, to create jobs, to stimulate, the general economy. And which is all great. But when there are so many wants that are coming out of the production of affordable housing, I'm always worried that at some point we're losing sight of producing housing. So that would be an observation that I have. On the financing side, honestly, the soft money that's out there, it's fabulous. This work would not happen unless there's soft money. That being said, soft money oftentimes comes with lots of bells and whistles to it. The work is already complex enough to try to get through the whole system and process, and with more rules and more requirements and deeper AMI skewing, it just creates its own challenges. That being said, the reason why there is a low-income housing tax credit program was because I think whenever it came up with like 30 years ago, the fact is affordable housing finance is tremendously difficult. It again, going back to this, it is not an industry that makes quote unquote economic sense, in the sense that you're trying to keep revenues low. The tax credit program, in fact, has been a tremendously successful program in generating affordable housing that, by virtue of the public-private partnership, has to a large degree over the 30 years of this program, we are generating quality product, and not that we're generating enough that is, because the demand far outweighs the supply, but it's been a highly effective program. So if anything, expand the tax credit program to the greatest extent we possibly can, and reduce complexity.
I have a couple fast ones to add to that as well. Tax credit program just made me think, keep, preserve, cherish, and make Community Reinvestment Act stronger probably would help us. That like super fundamental to getting these finance institutions to the table and really eager. I think CRA is so huge. I know this is Northern Virginia, but as a group that crosses borders and works regionally, I have to talk about Maryland a little bit. I think a huge thing that Montgomery County is doing that's really fantastic is the pilot program that they have for affordable housing, which is not something that Virginia jurisdiction. So that's a state level, state by state distinction. I was looking at the current
define pilot.
Yes, thank you. Pilot, payment in lieu of taxes. Sometimes the payment is $0 in lieu of taxes. Sometimes there are partial pilots where maybe you get a 25 or 30% discount. Montgomery County uses it pretty effectively to help acquisitions as well, where maybe you're acquiring a property and for a developer who's committing for a long-term affordability for 30% of the units, you get a 30% reduction on the property taxes. And in today's interest rate, with kind of terraces as an example, with Ken's like very repressed cash flow arms, $100,000 in operating expenses for something like property taxes is roughly $1 million of supportable debt in this interest rate and really tight cash flow environment. So the any ways that governments can help, and the main one is property taxes, reduce operating expenses is a huge help to the amount of debt that we can support and not need sources like AHIF to fill bigger and bigger gaps. And I would say flexible like acquisition funds. Montgomery County, like I said, the pilot program is a really big one for this, but not everyone who participates in the low-income housing tax credit program is a mission-driven nonprofit, and there are kind of phase-out windows, especially for early low-income housing tax credit communities that were built in the 90s, 15, 30 years. When they start hitting the market, they're at risk of, you can never fill up, this isn't my analogy, but you can never fill up the bucket of affordable housing fast enough. Development's very hard, but if you lose the bottom of the bucket and units that are currently affordable go offline, it's so tough to keep up. So I think flexible acquisition and helping mission-driven housing preservation is really important too.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And we did have a couple questions about the economics of preservation. And I think you did thanks for touching on that, and just, seeking that you're competing as affordable housing developers, nonprofits, in some cases with the market rate developers who can maybe pay more for faster. So, having that flexible acquisition finance is important. And then any sort of initiatives by local and state governments to maybe have a first right of refusal where, other selected developers can be the ones to, preserve that affordable housing so we're not losing because we're just behind already. So, all right. So we have 5 minutes. We're going to do a speed round. So short answers. You're thinking, you ready? You ready? Okay. So what changes, and either one of you can jump in, would make financing affordable housing easier? Any like top level changes you'd like to see to make the whole thing easier?
I'm giving
wait, go ahead.
I said I'm giving that one to you.
More credits. The easiest thing would be lots more credits. Secondarily would be simplicity.
Great. Okay. Any emerging trends or innovative housing finance models reshaping our sector? Maybe not here, but could be brought here.
I'm a bit of an old school kind of real estate development guy. To a large degree, it's about revenue, operating expenses, and NOI, and it's about sources and uses. And you put all of that stuff on a timeline. I I think there are some innovative structures that are out there. Somebody actually asked about a project that we did in Washington, D.C., which is sort of innovative in the sense that it's a true mixed income community where we have 30% AMI, 50% AMI done in a 4% and a 9% tax credit deal, along with 2/3 of the units are market rate, and it's a Class A building. It's got a wicked complicated financing structure, but it was a brilliant way to take disparate parts and put it together to create mixed income community with 3 separate capital stacks. So there is innovative thinking that's going on out there, but I think bread and butter real estate development is not that we shouldn't be thinking innovatively, but net revenue, operating expenses, NOI, sources, uses. Real estate development is what it is.
Awesome. Josh, anything else you want to add on that topic?
Nope.
No, you're good. Okay. Any other changes that you think the future holds to make this easier, faster, more efficient?
It's interesting. We're talking about a lot about operations a lot over the last several months. COVID was, it hammered the real estate section, and in particular, the affordable housing environment. To a large degree, COVID, quote unquote, is over. We've got the vaccine, the economy is coming back, this, that, and the other thing. We're seeing not just AHC, but organizations across the affordable housing industry are starting to see is that the low and moderate income tenant base that makes up most of our affordable housing are really struggling. They're struggling to pay rent. And some of it is economics. Some of it is, kind of a COVID hangover of the sort of dependence on some of the subsidy that was in the marketplace. But we're all now facing delinquency, and that in trying to clean up the delinquency in the existing portfolio and doing everything that we possibly can that we're not adding more delinquency as our residents continue to kind of struggle in the environment in which we're operating. That would be one of my greatest concerns right now.
Yeah.
I have a very quick thing to add to that about zoning. Applaud the great progress in Northern Virginia to open and reform and make zoning smoother for more types of housing. I think adding housing stock in a region that has a supply challenge is super important, even if it's not 100% committed affordable. And I hope to see in the near future other jurisdictions follow Northern Virginia's lead to open up their zoning policies and get more housing built across the whole income spectrum.
Awesome. Let's end it on that positive note. There is excitement coming. Josh, Ken, thank you so much for sharing all your knowledge. That hour went by super fast, but I know there's more questions, but great job. If you registered for the session, you will receive the recording. You'll receive the resources in that email that Hannah will follow up. So thank you all for your interest. Thanks for the hard work. Thanks for continued advocacy to make these changes we need to build and preserve more affordable housing.